The city had always felt alive, humming with energy, pulsing with the relentless march of progress. But now, as Aiven stood on the rooftop of a crumbling skyscraper, watching the sky split apart like a raw wound, the city felt like a graveyard. It started with the sky. It had cracked open a few weeks ago, leaving a jagged tear in the fabric of reality. At first, they thought it was a freak accident, a natural disaster, a freak storm, maybe. But it didn't take long to realize that this was no accident. The rift didn't just tear the sky, it tore apart the very laws of nature. Monsters, creatures from realms no one had seen before, poured through, bringing with them chaos, destruction, and madness. Aiven had seen them. He had fought them. And as the cities burned and governments fell, one truth became undeniable: the world needed more than just heroes. It needed a weapon, and Aiven had created one. With a single thought, his body surged with power. His veins pulsed with energy, antimatter coursing through him like fire. The crackling energy surrounded him, a magnetic storm that hummed through the air. His mind raced with calculations, his body shifting, warping in ways he didn't quite understand. But that didn't matter. What mattered was this: he had to protect what was left. From the shadows of the ruined buildings, a monstrous form emerged, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its claws scraping against the broken asphalt. Aiven didn't hesitate. He slammed his fist into the air, sending a shockwave of antimatter crashing toward the creature. The beast screamed as it was ripped apart, its molecules scattering into the void. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that made everything seem surreal. Aiven stood alone, breathing heavily, his skin flickering between dimensions. He was no longer just a man. He was something else. A force, a symbol, an idea. And that was enough. The world had descended into madness, but Aiven wasn't the type to just sit back and let things happen. No, he had a plan. He'd always had a plan. And now, with his newfound power, it was time to take action. He needed a team. Zara, he muttered to himself, looking down at the map in front of him. I'm going to need her. Zara was a force of nature herself. A former Olympic athlete, she had been caught in the middle of a rogue antimatter experiment. The accident altered her biology, enhancing her physical abilities to superhuman levels. She could run faster than a speeding car, leap over buildings with ease, and hit harder than most trained soldiers. But despite her abilities, Zara wasn't a hero. Not by a long shot. She'd lost too much to ever believe in saving the world again. But Aiven knew she was the key. He just had to get to her before the city did. Finding her wasn't easy. Aiven had to track her down in the underbelly of the city, where the survivors had taken refuge. It wasn't the safest place to be, but it was where Zara was hiding, far away from the government recruiters and the people who were trying to force her back into the spotlight. When he found her, she wasn't exactly thrilled to see him. "You're the one who created this mess, aren't you?" she asked, her voice cold as she leaned against the crumbling wall of a ruined warehouse. Her body was bruised, her eyes hard. Aiven could feel the weight of her words. He'd never expected anyone to forgive him for what had happened. After all, the world had fallen apart because of his experiments. But he wasn't here for forgiveness. He was here because the world still needed saving. "Zara, listen. I know you're angry. But I need your help. The world needs your help." She snorted. "And why should I care? Why should I risk my life for a world that couldn't care less about me?" Aiven took a deep breath. "Because we're the only ones left who can fix it. You think you're the only one who's lost everything? You think I'm doing this because I want to? This is what we were born for. We can either keep running or fight." Zara stood in silence for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, with a tired sigh, she nodded. "Fine. But this is the last time I'm playing hero. After this, I'm out." Aiven grinned. "That's the spirit." The next few days were a blur of chaos. Aiven was on the move, tracking down the other members of his team. Each one of them was a unique case, someone who had been altered by antimatter in ways that made them both dangerous and necessary. Lyle, the ex-soldier, had been part of an experiment gone wrong. He'd been exposed to antimatter in a way that made him immune to its destructive side effects. But it had also left him with a permanent condition: he couldn't feel anything. His body was numb to pain, and his mind was a bit fractured. Valeria was a hacker, a genius who had been caught in an accident involving a government experiment. Her mind had fused with the digital world, allowing her to manipulate systems with nothing more than her thoughts. But the cost was high. She was constantly battling the voices in her head, the echo of data streams and code that threatened to consume her. And Eric, well, Eric was a mystery. A gentle giant of a man, whose exposure to antimatter had granted him the ability to manipulate gravity. He could lift massive objects with a mere thought, but his powers came with a dark side. Every time he used them, his mind slipped a little further from reality. The team came together slowly, each member bringing their own skills and baggage to the table. But despite their differences, there was something undeniable about the way they worked together. They were a family, bound by fate and the strange force of antimatter that had shaped them. But even as they began to form a cohesive unit, the world outside was growing darker. The Umbra Syndicate, a shadowy organization with its own agenda, had begun to make its move. They were the ones behind the rifts, the ones who had been experimenting with antimatter long before Aiven and his team had come onto the scene, and their plan was simple. They wanted to control the rifts, to harness the power of antimatter to reshape the world in their own image. And Aiven knew that if they succeeded, there would be no stopping them. The team's first real test came when the Syndicate opened another rift, this time in the heart of a major city. The monsters that spilled out were unlike anything they had ever seen: massive, grotesque creatures that seemed to be made of living shadow and energy. They rampaged through the city, tearing apart buildings, killing anyone in their path. Aiven called the team together, but as they gathered, he could see the hesitation in their eyes. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained for this. They were just people who had been thrown into a world they didn't understand, with powers they couldn't control. But Aiven didn't have time for doubts. "We do this together, or we die alone," he said, his voice steady, even though he could feel the strain in his own body. The antimatter within him was growing stronger, but so was the toll it was taking. His skin was beginning to show signs of distortion, flickering between realities. Zara nodded, adjusting her gear. "Let's get it over with." They arrived at the city center, where the rift was still pulsing with energy. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Aiven felt a surge of power. This was what they were meant to do. The battle was fierce. The monsters were fast, and their bodies seemed to shift and bend in ways that defied the laws of physics. But Zara was faster. Lyle's rifle sang as he took down one creature after another. Valeria hacked into the city's infrastructure, shutting down security systems to keep the monsters at bay. And Eric, with his gravity manipulation, sent entire buildings toppling over, crushing the creatures beneath. But despite their efforts, they were outnumbered. The rift was still open, and more creatures were pouring through. "We need to close it," Aiven shouted. "Zara, get to the center. Lyle, cover her." Lyle shot a look at Aiven. "You're sure this is going to work?" Aiven didn't answer. He didn't have time to explain. He was already pushing his powers to their limits, using antimatter to try and seal the rift. His body began to flicker, his skin twisting as if it were caught between dimensions. But he gritted his teeth and pressed on. The world depended on him. On them, the rift began to shrink, but not without cost. Aiven could feel his strength draining, his body beginning to tear apart. And yet, he kept going. The rift closed, and the monsters were gone, but Aiven collapsed to the ground, his body unable to bear the strain any longer. Aiven's body collapsed on the rubble-strewn ground, and his limbs twitched erratically, his skin rippling in strange ways, flickering like a broken signal. His breath was ragged, uneven, as though each intake of air took him a step closer to oblivion. His team gathered around him, each of them stunned into a brief silence as the gravity of their victory, and his condition, settled over them. Is he? Valeria's voice trailed off, her usual calm overtaken by a rare crack of emotion. He's not dead, Zara said, crouching beside Aiven, her fingers touching his neck, feeling for a pulse. There was one, weak but steady. But damn, he's pushing himself too hard. Eric kneeled next to them, his massive form causing the ground beneath him to tremble slightly. He looked at Aiven with a mixture of concern and unease. We need to get him out of here. Fast. Lyle, ever the skeptic, was scanning their surroundings with sharp eyes. He hadn't been entirely convinced that this antimatter was worth the risk. But even he couldn't deny that they had managed to close the rift. They had done something no one else could have. Still, Lyle couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that Aiven was unraveling just as much as he was piecing things together. The scientist's growing obsession with antimatter was becoming harder to ignore. As Zara and Eric lifted Aiven carefully, his body flickered again, and for a split second, it seemed as though he wasn't even there. He was a shadow, a half-formed figure, as though his very essence were slipping through the cracks of existence. But then he solidified once more, the moment passing as quickly as it came. I told you not to push yourself like this, Zara muttered, more to herself than to Aiven. He blinked, his eyes sluggishly focusing on her. There was a brief, half-smile that tugged at his lips, despite the exhaustion. Tell me when I actually listen to you. Zara rolled her eyes, but the smallest trace of warmth spread through her. She had never been one to get close to people, especially not after what she'd been through, but Aiven's reckless, unrelenting nature had a way of getting under her skin. We're getting you back to base, she said, her voice firm, but there was no denying the concern in her tone. Aiven made a half-hearted gesture, trying to wave them off. It's just a few cracks. I've had worse. He winced as his body flickered again, more violently this time. Okay, maybe not. They moved quickly through the remnants of the city, avoiding the occasional monster that hadn't been completely driven back into the rift. The creatures were still lurking, but they were scattered now, disoriented, their link to the rift severed. The city had been saved, for now, but it was clear that their battle was far from over. As they reached their makeshift headquarters, a hidden lab deep within the city, Zara and Eric sat Aiven down on a table, where Valeria immediately began scanning him with a portable diagnostic tool. The flickering had gotten worse since the battle. Aiven's body was becoming increasingly unstable, the antimatter inside him threatening to tear him apart at any given moment. Valeria's face was grim as she analyzed the data. His molecular integrity is failing. The antimatter it's becoming too much for him. He's trying to stabilize, but he's too far gone. Lyle crossed his arms, a frown creasing his brow. We need to get him out of here. This whole thing, this team, this idea, it's all too dangerous. We're not just fighting monsters anymore. We're fighting something we don't understand. Aiven let out a low laugh, his voice raspy. That's the point, Lyle. We never understood it. That's why we're here. Zara shot Lyle a sharp look, one that silenced him before he could protest further. This isn't the time for doubts. We know what's at stake. We've seen what happens when we fail. We've seen the rifts. She turned back to Aiven, her eyes softening for a moment. And we're not letting you die just yet, Aiven. Not while there's still work to be done. Aiven managed another grin, although it was more painful than anything. That's the spirit. Always looking on the bright side. He knew they were right. They had to keep fighting. Even if it meant pushing themselves to the edge of their own destruction. But deep down, Aiven couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The antimatter coursing through his veins wasn't just a power, it was a ticking time bomb, one that threatened to explode if he didn't find a way to control it soon. The days following the battle were a blur of planning, repairs, and occasional moments of respite. The team was adjusting to their new dynamic, learning how to work together, how to trust each other. But the unspoken tension was always there, lingering beneath the surface. Aiven was no longer the same man he had been. His powers were consuming him, slowly tearing apart his body, and every time he used them, it was a reminder of how close he was to the brink. Zara, Valeria, Eric, and Lyle each had their own struggles to contend with. But it was Aiven who bore the heaviest burden. He was the one who had started this all, the one who had created the Antimatter Legion, who had drawn them all into this war. And now, he was beginning to realize that his role as their leader was slipping from his grasp. He could see it in the way Zara had started to take charge during missions, in the way Eric's voice had grown more authoritative, in the way Lyle's cynicism had started to take on a more strategic edge. They didn't need him to lead them anymore. They were becoming a team without him, and yet, he couldn't stop. He couldn't let go. He spent hours poring over research, examining data from their last mission, trying to find a way to stabilize himself. But the answers were always just out of reach, like a mirage that disappeared every time he reached for it. The more he pushed himself to find a solution, the worse his condition became. One night, as the team gathered for a debriefing, Aiven couldn't help but notice how much things had changed. The atmosphere in the room was different, lighter, almost. Zara, Valeria, and Eric were laughing over something Lyle had said. For a brief moment, it felt like they were just a group of people who had found their way into something bigger than themselves. And Aiven wasn't sure where he fit anymore. "I've been thinking," Lyle said, his voice cutting through the conversation. "We know the Syndicate's been playing with rifts for a while now. We know they want to open a permanent one. But what if they're not doing it just for power? What if they're trying to merge the worlds? What if they want to combine our reality with theirs?" Zara nodded, her expression serious. "It's a possibility. And if they succeed, the entire fabric of reality could collapse. There won't be any us left." Aiven's head snapped up, his mind racing. "They're not just trying to conquer. They're trying to replace us. To rewrite everything." "And what happens if they succeed?" Valeria asked. "What happens to people like us? To Aiven?" Aiven's heart sank. He didn't have an answer. But he knew one thing for sure: they were running out of time. The next mission came quickly. The Syndicate had opened a massive rift in the center of another major city, and this time, the threat wasn't just monsters. It was a full-scale invasion, an army of creatures from 1,000 worlds, all pouring through the rift like a tidal wave. Aiven had no choice but to lead the charge. His body was barely holding together, but there was no stopping him now. The team was ready: Zara's speed, Lyle's precision, Valeria's intellect, Eric's brute strength. Together, they would stand against the oncoming storm. The battle was brutal. The team fought with everything they had, pushing themselves to their limits. Aiven stood at the forefront, his antimatter powers flaring as he created shockwaves of energy to hold the creatures at bay. Each blast was a drain on his already fragile body, but he didn't care. They couldn't lose. Not like this. The rift was closing, but the battle wasn't over. As the last wave of creatures was wiped out, Aiven felt something snap inside him. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to spin. His body flickered once more, and for a moment, it seemed as though he wasn't there at all, but then he saw them, his team, fighting with everything they had. And in that moment, Aiven knew that they would carry on without him. Aiven's body trembled, every cell in his being screaming for rest, for the release of pressure he'd been under for so long. His vision blurred, the edges of his sight warping as if the world itself were unraveling before him. He stumbled, and for a moment, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, like he was standing in two places at once. It wasn't just the antimatter now, it was the rift's gravitational pull, tearing at the fabric of his existence. He could feel himself flickering, disappearing and reappearing in fragments. But there was no time for that. There was no time to collapse or fall apart. He had to see this through. Aiven gathered the last of his strength, focusing on the rift that was still open above them, a swirling vortex of pure chaos. The sky above the city was torn wide open, dark, jagged, and seething with unnatural energy. The ground was cracked, the air thick with tension, and the syndicate forces were drawing closer. The team was fighting back, Zara slicing through the air with speed that defied reality, Lyle's precision shots cutting down enemies with ruthless efficiency, Eric sending shockwaves of gravity that shook entire blocks off their foundations. They were relentless, working like a well-oiled machine, and for the briefest of moments, Aiven allowed himself to take solace in that fact. But the rift wasn't closing. Not yet. The longer it stayed open, the more the fabric of reality bent and warped, pulling things, people, into its grasp. Aiven's body flickered again. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, stepping through the wreckage, barely aware of the world around him. He could feel the antimatter pulling at his insides, but it wasn't just that now. It was the weight of leadership, of the promises he had made, the trust he had earned from each of his team members. They were counting on him. Zara glanced over her shoulder and saw Aiven's flickering form. Her eyes widened. "Aiven," she shouted, but there was no time for anything more. She fought through another wave of creatures, her body moving at impossible speeds, but the fear she felt for Aiven was undeniable. Lyle was watching too, the skepticism in his eyes replaced by something more complex. He had always questioned Aiven's methods, but now, seeing the toll it was taking on their leader, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. They had all become pawns in a war they didn't choose, but it was Aiven who had set them on this path. It was Aiven who had sacrificed himself for them all. Aiven's fingers twitched as he raised his hand toward the rift. He had always known that he was skating on the edge of something dangerous, but the reality was harsher than he had imagined. The energy swirling in the rift was more than just raw force. It was a manifestation of everything he had tried to control, of everything he had tried to shape into a weapon. Now it was all slipping through his fingers, and then it hit him that he wasn't just fighting the syndicate. He wasn't just fighting the monsters from other worlds. He was fighting himself. The rift was a reflection of his own inner turmoil. His obsession with antimatter, his unwillingness to let go, his drive to save the world, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The power was intoxicating, and it had consumed him. But now, in the heat of battle, as his body threatened to disintegrate, Aiven understood that he couldn't control it any longer. He had to let go. With a sharp breath, Aiven pushed out the thoughts that clouded his mind. He reached deep inside himself, tapping into the very core of the antimatter that had sustained him. His hand crackled with energy, and the ground beneath him cracked as his power surged outward. He could feel his body flickering again, but this time he fought it, trying to hold on to the moment, to the reality that was around him. His pulse roared in his ears, the sound of a countdown, a ticking clock. The rift began to shrink, slowly at first, as if uncertain whether to yield to his will. But then, something changed. The energy from the rift started to fight back. The pull of the rift intensified, dragging at Aiven's very being, like a force greater than gravity, greater than time. He could feel himself slipping, being pulled apart. His very essence seemed to be coming apart at the seams. His vision blurred again, but this time, instead of his body flickering between realities, he saw the faces of his team. He saw Zara, her eyes fierce as she fought with every ounce of strength she had. He saw Lyle, his stoic expression finally cracking, revealing the man behind the soldier. He saw Valeria, her hands trembling but determined, and Eric, who had come so far from the silent, broken giant he had once been. In that moment, Aiven realized something that he had never truly understood before: the power wasn't in him. It never had been. It was in them. His hand shot out one last time, and this time, the rift began to close with a violent crack, the energy collapsing on itself as it was drawn back into the nothingness from which it had come. The last of the creatures screeched as they were sucked back into the void, disappearing from existence. Aiven fell to his knees, his body finally succumbing to the strain. His chest heaved, and the world around him began to lose focus. But despite everything, despite the exhaustion, despite the flickering and the pain, he could still hear them. His team. His family. They had done it. Is it over? Valeria's voice was soft but filled with uncertainty. Aiven's mouth barely moved as he whispered, "For now." His eyes closed, and his body finally gave in to the weight of the antimatter that had been consuming him. But in that moment, he didn't feel fear. He didn't feel pain. He felt peace. The rift had closed. The world was saved, at least for now. The Antimatter Legion had done what no one else could. They had stopped the collapse of reality itself. But the victory had come at a great cost. Aiven's body was unrecognizable, a mere shell of the man he had been. His skin was burned, his bones shattered, his organs strained to the breaking point. It was a miracle he was still alive, but the truth was, he wasn't. He was fading. Zara and Eric were the first to gather around him, their faces grim but determined. They had seen the price of victory, and they knew it hadn't been without sacrifice. Aiven's sacrifice. "We're going to get you help," Zara whispered, her voice cracking. "We'll find a way to fix this. You're not done yet." Aiven's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. His voice was barely a whisper, but there was a smile on his lips. "I don't need fixing, Zara. You've got this. You're ready." Zara shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "I can't." Aiven's fingers brushed against hers, the last contact they would ever share. His eyes closed again, his breathing shallow, but his words rang out in her mind. "You're ready." And in that moment, she realized he was right. She was ready. The team gathered around Aiven's lifeless body, a sense of finality settling over them. They had fought for the world, but in the end, it was Aiven who had shown them the way. It was Aiven who had sacrificed everything. Zara stood tall, the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. She wasn't alone. They weren't alone. The Antimatter Legion would continue, for as long as they could, and somewhere, in the space between realities, Aiven's voice echoed, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a symbol. A symbol of sacrifice. A symbol of hope.